Trees don't have to be a struggle to draw. A little understanding of how trees grow and what sorts of marks can capture the effects on a tree makes all the difference, because it's not just how the leaves in a particular tree look, how they grow, but also whereabouts on the tree they are from our viewing point. Once we understand this, finding the best marks to draw to create the tree we want and to have it looking like a real tree becomes easy. The first thing to realize is that when we look at a tree canopy, it's not a flat shape. It's not a two-dimensional shape that we could cut out and paste somewhere else. In life, it's a three-dimensional form. Often, trees have a spherical shape or a half-rounded three-dimensional form. And that means that what we see at the top is further away from us than what we see often around this spot. Depends a bit on the particular tree, because photos tend to make trees look very flat. They tend to take away this sense of parts of the tree being closer to us than others. We need to work out from whatever clues we get what parts of the tree are closest and what parts are further away. And so notice I've got a lighter line here with some breaks in it to help indicate that this isn't just further away from this more heavily drawn area, but that also it's curving away from us, and that creates a fairly light edge compared to areas that are more straight on, such as the trunk. This more broken line up the top is also effective because we often have a more jagged silhouette effect from the way the leaves on the top are seen as opposed to the ways they're seen underneath. And notice that generally I've created the overall shape of this tree canopy with the hatching. I've almost tried to see it as a ball and hatch the shadows of a ball with the light coming down from here, but allowing for the irregularities. But of course, this is a very fast drawing, a very quick drawing of a tree. We can make it a little more complex with a little more time. We can create some more distinctions, make it look less like a ball and a little more individual. But notice I'm still working on the sense of creating the roundness of the shape, a jagged effect along the top where we don't see things quite as clearly as we see them where they're closer to us in the middle section. But I'm also aware that the darker areas I see here are going to be closer to me generally than these darker areas around here, because these ones are also moving away from me. So being aware of the tree, its three-dimensional form in space, what's closest, what's further, is key to finding the right marks to create a real looking tree. But the more time we've got to first understand and then try and capture the three-dimensionality of the tree, the better chance we have of choosing the right marks and putting them in the right way. Notice that there are broken areas of shade in here. The canopy doesn't have to be all one solid piece. In fact, living in Australia where there are so many eucalyptus trees, for me, tree canopies are more often fragments of foliage, clusters, clumps of foliage joined together by the branching of the tree. But each one of these, therefore, I understand and see in the same way, and that some of these clumps are closer to me than others, such as these ones here. And sometimes these higher ones can be closer if these branches are coming right out at me. And equally, there are clusters of foliage that are actually completely on the other side of the tree, such as these ones here, which I've used hatching marks to create. Each of these drawings has their own video on my How to Draw Trees playlist, where you'll get to see the reference and hear my strategy for starting, choosing where to start, and progressing each of these scenes. And watching a couple of those videos, if you haven't, is a great way to reinforce and put more into practice what I'm talking about here. And notice how I have found very different marks to indicate the foliage at ground level. Some of it is silhouette, but what I've sought to do here is to capture the actual silhouette in the reference. These fuller ones that are more leafy, you can see lots of hatching lines to help get a sense of the shadow, the shaded areas in this. But again, even here, you can see on top, I've got some dotted lines to give a sense of the jagged leaf effect of the silhouette. And also I've left some white areas to indicate where there's light on this form to help give a sense of roundedness. Sometimes though, if we're relatively close to a tree that has relatively large leaves, finding marks to actually indicate individual leaves can be the most helpful way for creating a realistic effect. And in this tree, that's the case. But even so, I've tried to put my marks on the paper in a way that these ones, which are the closest ones to us, look and feel closer than these marks for leaves that are further away. And these ones here are closer than these or these. These ones are a bit closer. So I'm using heavier marks that are positioned more carefully in relation to each other to show the actual, if you like, pattern, the way the leaves for this particular eucalyptus are clustered together on the ends of the twigs and branches. But I can't use different marks for leaves of different distance if I haven't first observed it in my reference. Sometimes I actually circle the closest leaves in my photo before I start to help me focus on using different marks for those closer ones than for my further ones. But the marks I use aren't just for the distance I am from that foliage. This small group of shrubby growths, if we look at the marks I've used, we can see that these upper ones are fairly upright, fairly vertical. But if we look at these ones at the side, see how they're now more leaning over at 45 degrees. And when we get down here, we can see that in fact a lot of these marks are angled straight down or at a much steeper angle. And that's because that's the way the leaf growth changes from when it's new, and the new growth is always at the end of branches. It tends to point up, and the branches that are growing most vigorously, those branches themselves are pointed up more, and the growth on the ends is more pointed upright. But as the branch grows longer, it starts to sag down. As the foliage grows longer, it starts to get heavier and often starts to sag down more. And so we get this upright, less upright, less upright, less upright, maybe not upright at all, growth. And I need to have my marks reflect that if I want my tree, my shrub, my bush, whatever it is, to look realistic. And remember, this is a three-dimensional form. It's not just like this, but this part here that I'm looking at, it's like this, and now it's bending towards me, it's bending towards me, it's bending towards me. So I'm looking here at this foliage edge on. And that's an important thing again to realize, to never forget the three-dimensionality of our form, which means that my hatching is creating darker areas lower down and darker areas on the side that's away from the light, which in this case is coming down from here. So my darkest areas are going to be here. And those darkest areas include whatever I do for the branches, the trunks as well. My darker one should be over here, not so much over here. And it's not so important whether it's a small, relatively quickly drawn shrub or an enormous tree that we take a lot more time and care with our marks. The principle is the same. Know the direction the light's coming from, see the three-dimensional form, and find marks that reflect the growth of this particular tree. But of course that changes if we're really close up to it or if we're really further away. the individual growth habits may not be so significant when we have a large tree that's some distance away, but we still want to create a light effect on the edges that are curving away from us. We want to find marks that represent the irregular shape. This is not an edge that a continuous outline is going to represent well. And even here, down here, look how these marks still start to angle down slightly. These ones that we can see most clearly. The most important edges are the ones that we see most clearly, where we have ink with nothing around it, basically. So there is still a sense, even though I'm not trying to draw leaves here, there is still a sense of that, of the foliage hanging down more, at the very least due to the effect of gravity at the lower sections. And while usually with foliage, we're doing the hatching marks to represent the curvature of the individual bunches of foliage, sometimes man has changed this, as in this hedge, where we now have, if you like, a relatively straight wall of foliage. And so my hatching lines are far more up and down to reflect that underlying form. But I still have to create irregularities in that with my hatching to give a sense of the gaps in the foliage where shadows are cast within it that we can see. And notice, while this foliage down here isn't from a tree, it's from strappy-leaved plants, the principle of observing the shape and direction of the individual foliage and trying to capture that, not in detail, but in the effect, and to particularly capture the three-dimensionality of it. And notice I've drawn it in more detail where it's closer than where it's further away. And this is the same principle that I've used in my big trees. It's just that there's a greater difference in what we draw from closer to further away when all of it is closer. Also notice the edge along here. I've done a similar sort of thing as I've done on the tree canopy, but there are more marks because we're closer. And notice they are heavier and darker where this edge is closest than up here where it's further away, because that helps create the sense of distance and of three dimensions. This is a rectangular block as opposed to some sort of spherical tree canopy shape, but a rectangular block is still a three-dimensional form. And bear in mind that sometimes we can do a better job of capturing the effect of the foliage in the light by actually concentrating on drawing the shapes behind, particularly when we draw with ink and we can't put white over any dark that we've drawn earlier. But again, although I'm using negative space to do it, I'm paying attention to the silhouette, and you'll notice that the growth up the top is more upright, more vertical, and then as the bush grows out, it starts to drop and sag and lower. And again, here, I've drawn it in a way to represent the fact that I'm seeing these branches edge on because they're coming straight out at me. And so I've drawn them differently to what I've drawn here because what I'm seeing is different. Observation is key. Let me do a quick run through of a few drawings. Here we have the top of a gum tree, and you can see the dotted lines for the buds of leaves and the curving away, and particularly on this side, the sunlight. We have growth that's falling down, that's in the shadows, and where we have actual indications of individual leaves. Though here we have more of a shrubby bush that has very upright growth. These are almost more like pine needles than they are leaves. But look at the contrast with this clumpy, strappy plant here, where we've got marks that from a foliage point of view create a very different effect, where we have some really dark shadows that help define the long spear-like or sword-like shape. And we have these contrast of angles where these tall, strappy plants at some point grow too long, weaken a little, and bend down, often with a definite crease. Sometimes when we have very spindly growth and not a great deal of foliage, it can create quite individualistic form. And in that case, as I said, careful observation and finding marks that create the, firstly, see the shapes, but then translate those shapes into the three-dimensional form. From a cutout area to a curving surface. When we have trees such as this pine tree, we have a different growth habit. We have clusters of pine needles that sometimes angle upwards and sometimes angle downwards, but they form almost like a lot of ball-like structures that cover quite thickly the areas where we have canopy. In this case, the needles are falling downwards. And particularly on the silhouettes, it's important to get a strong sense of that underlying structure, which, as well as collecting shadows, notice that it also collects the light. So it's hatching that creates the darker clumps that are in shade or shadow, but also reflects the areas of light where we need to actually show restraint in putting in marks. But just a couple of marks in these better lit areas, just to create a visual reminder that this is a three-dimensional form. And again, where the light is striking more fully, lighter marks as well. And bear in mind that when we have a very tall tree, it's not that these parts are closer to us than these parts, but that this is closer to us than what's further up. And look at the difference in the marks I've used over here. Very much giving a sense that these are not pine trees and that they're further away because I've used different marks to capture the form and the distance. Here we have another, I think it's a pine tree, with a very different, more upright growth habit. And notice how at the top, the new growth looks quite different to how it looks down the bottom. Observation and then finding marks. Down here, it's a bit more of a silhouette effect, but towards the base where we have much more growth, much more developed, we get these, in some ways, challenging to draw forms of these upward curving, triangular, sword-shaped, pyramid-shaped structures. But with other trees, the growth may be more similar right the way to the top. This is a very quick, just 1 or 2 minute sketch. Other times we need to be alert, such as with this fir tree, for the delicacy of the effect of these long needles that hang down with an incredibly strong sense of sag. And in fact, it's not just the needles that sag down, but the branches themselves seem to sag very quickly as they grow, almost to the point of just drooping straight down. When it comes to drooping straight down, palm trees come to mind, where we have, often in drawings, a very two-dimensional approach. But instead of the cartoon trees that almost look like a cross-section, we want to remember that as well as seeing branches that go straight up, or fronds really, that go straight up and then arch out, that in fact this is again a three-dimensional ball that we're looking at. Perhaps we can see it with greater clarity in a more detailed drawing. It's not just upwards and around, it's also coming straight at us, so that often we just see the tip of some of these fronds that are actually curved down towards us, as if we're looking straight onto these ones here. A lot of shade and a lot of shadowed areas, as well as trying to create the effect of the overall shape of the frond, but also to give the suggestion of the individualization of the, I think of them as the leaves of the frond. So we need to find marks that create a balance between the overall shape of a frond, but also the fact that each frond is made up of individual sections. And exactly where our emphasis with our marks lies does depend also on the size of our drawing, the pen we're using, the time we have, and what we want to emphasize. There is no right answer for the marks for a palm or for any tree. It all depends on all of these factors. And if we're really close up, we need to pay a lot more attention in our observation and create more, if you like, one-to-one references in what we draw without going further than we need. but we want to give a sense that these fronds, some of them are coming over the top, some of them we're seeing side on, and some of them are going straight up. Some of them are angled to us so that we really see them flat on, and others are almost edge on or something in between. And we still need to see our three-dimensional ball shape. Our light coming down from here creates more shade and shadow on this side. And so I've drawn some of these fronds totally in darkness, but at times I've created gaps that indicate other fronds, especially ones passing in front of, through negative spacing. Here I've got fronds I've drawn, and then I've got a frond behind that I've drawn by drawing the shadows. Sometimes I've just doubled up on the lines to indicate overlap. Sometimes I've strongly favoured one of two overlapping sections. Other times it's less obvious exactly what's happening. All of which I think mimic the effect that we have when we look at this palm tree at this distance in life. And what we want is to be able to create a lot of different marks that create different effects of different types of foliage. Sometimes when there's a lot of foliage in a given scene, it can be very confusing, and yet foliage can be a wonderfully interesting subject to add, particularly when it's contrasted with the clean lines and clear spaces of interesting architecture. Sometimes with very close foliage, it's good to draw individual leaves for a little part of it, but not too many, because then it will start to look cartoon-like. As we move further back with different types of foliage that are further away and that are different colours and that have different lighting, we find different marks. There is no right way, but it's becoming aware of our options, having a range of marks and an understanding of how trees grow and how light affects them. That gives us the resources to draw any one scene. Sometimes leaves can be very large, almost sculptural, and demand individual attention. Other times, that's not the case. Sometimes we see the trees through the darknesses that are behind. But with a little understanding, a lot of observation, and some thoughtful planning, we can create a whole range of effects for different foliage that combines to create wonderful scenes where we don't get lost, where we can see different types of foliage and the depth between the closest and the furthest away, different types of trees, even get a sense of the different colours of which ones are darker colours and which ones are lighter colours, and so forth. G'day, I'm Stephen Travers. Hope this has been interesting. And remember, every one of the drawings that you've seen has its own video. So if you look at my How to Draw Trees playlist, scroll through the thumbnails until you see the drawing that you're interested in, and you can hear a more detailed explanation in that demo of what I'm doing and why I'm doing it for that particular tree. But in the end, whatever you draw, however you draw it, and however your trees turn out, make sure you have fun. I'll see you next time. Bye.